start by opening up the 13 start file that's in the exercise 13 module. When you have the exercise 13 file labeled 13 start open, it should look like this. We have 3 different artboards that we're working with. And so we're going to start on artboard 1. So I want you to navigate to the pattern that's abstract that looks like this. And if you need to, again, it's based on personal preference, but choose your zoom tool and zoom in on the artboard so that you can see what you're doing a bit better. And then we're going to go to the selection tool and draw a marquee box around all of the pattern shapes. So they should all be selected like this as soon as you draw your box. Then we're going to go up to the top of the screen and work a bit more with our object option. So choose object, and then pattern, and then make. So you're going to see that when the pattern comes up, it's now repeating. Is yours cut off?
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I just had one extra step I needed to click to say okay with the panel that popped up. So if yours is cut off, just go ahead and click okay with that dialog box. Depending on the version of Creative Cloud or Illustrator that you're working with, there's different ways of creating patterns and different dialog boxes that might pop up. And so generally you want to click through and say okay on them, and that way you'll get through to the next step. But it's making sure that it's going to line up with previous versions of Illustrator, because many patterns carry over into the new version. So that's the idea behind that. So you should have something that looks like this on your screen. It should now be repeating. Then you have a pattern options window that has popped up. So we are going to make some changes in this options window. We're going to name this Peacock Abstract. And then if you look right below the name area, there's a drop-down menu titled Tile Type. If you drop down, look at the different options that you have here. We're actually going to choose text by column, but before you do that, go ahead and click on the different ones to see how they change. So if you do brick by row, it's going to align them very straight in rows and kind of alternating like you would bricks. If I do brick by column, it's just going to rearrange that brick pattern into vertical columns. For us, we're going to choose hex by column. So you should have something that looks like this. Then if you go down, and we're not going to worry about width and height right now, but you can definitely make these manual adjustments if you're working with your own patterns. There's an option to choose overlap. Oftentimes, to make a seamless pattern, you want to choose some type of overlap that will complement what you're doing. So in this case, we're going to choose left in front, and that's the first option you see here. And then by default, it's set to top in front, and we're just going to leave that as is. Then you're going to make sure that the show tile edge box is unchecked. You might have that as a default setting, but make sure it's unchecked. Yes.
There's a bunch of girls who can't download the files, so we're emailing them to them, so we might pause for a second.
Oh, absolutely, yes. We can definitely do that.
There's many of them.
Is the emailing function working?
It has before when she emails it to us.
Okay, okay. I could try emailing it to everybody. Should I do that?
I think she got everyone.
Okay.
You need it? Okay.
I don't always know why that happens. It seems very random.
Oh yeah, campers.
But we go with it.
Does anybody else need it? And please turn off your cell phone. I heard so many message ringtones. Because I have the same ringtone too, so they make me feel like we're too much.
I'm just going to back up and then I can run through this real quick. If you are at a place where you are not having an issue with the file, one of the things we're going to do later on is work with scanned fabric. So if you're interested, you can take a picture of fabric that you're wearing today and integrate that into a pattern swatch. So if you want to play around with that, you can, but I also have swatches for you in the file. So.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's weird. Yeah. So is everybody got the image now? Ready to go? Yes. Okay, one more.
Okay. We at least need to be at the place where everyone can open the file before we go forward. That's important.
Yes, this is teamwork class. go, Dr. Grace.
Okay, good to go. So if you're just joining us in the file, we are going to return to our regularly scheduled program with pattern making. So you're going to use the selection tool with this pattern here on Artboard 1. And you're going to draw a rectangle marquee around it to select the whole thing. As soon as it's selected, you should see that all pieces have a bounding box like this. Then we're going to go up to our object menu at the top of the screen. We're going to choose object and then scroll down to pattern and then make. As soon as you've done this, it's probably going to give you some type of editing mode dialog box, and your pattern is going to look cut off. Just go ahead and say OK. And what this is going to tell you in this case is that any changes you make are going to be applied to the swatch. So if you want to make swatches after this from this pattern, you need to create a new one and save it separately. Now we see our whole pattern in place. So it's repeating. There's a pattern options window that has come up as well. So we're going to make the changes that you see in step 4 in this window. We're going to name it Peacock Abstract. For the tile type, I want you to just for a second play around with what these different tile types look like. Brick by row will look like this. Brick by column will change to look like this. And then our tile type is going to be hex by column, and it will look like this. Oftentimes in apparel patterns, if you have something a little bit more complex like this, you want to go with a hex by column because it will allow you to create a more scaled down pattern that looks a bit more realistic. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you play around with patterns. However, it will depend on your shapes as well, but you might want to start with hex by column and go from there. Then we're going to go down to the overlap area, and we're going to choose left in front. So it's the first one here with the left diamond solid. It has a default setting of top in front, and that is going to be what we stick with. I generally stick with top in front. I think it looks better, but it's kind of an aesthetic preference. Then make sure that the show tile edge box is unchecked. You might have this as a default setting, and if your computer does, uncheck it. When you're finished, you need to get out of pattern mode. So we're going to go up to the light gray horizontal bar at the top of the screen. Before I do that, I want to show you real quick. In this area at the bottom of the pattern options menu, there's a box that says dim copies to 50%. Now, one of the functions that this does is if you want to play with rearranging your pattern, you can move the original and it will copy it in your pattern for you. That way, you can still see where the original is and not have to determine exactly how each individual shape needs to be moved. So if I want to move my original, all I have to do is move it, and it will adjust it in the whole pattern. So that's another little trick to know. So up at the top, we have our light gray bar, and we're going to choose done to exit our pattern mode. Now go back, and you might already have it selected still, but choose the selection tool and draw a marquee around the dress to select it. Then you're going to go up to Window, Swatches. And my swatch menu is already open. And your swatch menu might already be open on the right bar here. If it's not, use your window swatches command. So in the swatches panel, I want you to navigate down to the row that includes patterns. And generally, they're going to be added at the end. So they'll probably be about 3 or 4 rows down because you haven't created too many swatches yet. So in my case, they're 3 rows down. And it's right at the end here. If I hover over this thumbnail image of it, it tells me that this is my Peacock abstract tile. So click on the thumbnail image of this pattern, and it should automatically apply to the dress like this. One of the things that's important to do with patterns is to make sure that the stroke, as soon as you apply the pattern, is set to black or some color that still maintains the outline. So double check that your stroke is set to black, because otherwise you're going to have a floating shape. If I, for example, have some type of setting that turns my stroke off, it's going to look really funny like this. So make sure that you have a stroke that creates an outline. Now we're going to leave the pattern as is for now. We're going to work with scaling it down later because it's pretty big still. This would probably be overwhelming unless you're really fashion forward. So we want to now make a couple more adjustments to the dress so that we can see the wrong side of the fabric. So draw a marquee box using the selection tool around your dress. And then right-click on the white area of the artboard. You're going to choose Ungroup so that you can isolate different parts of the dress. Now go up to the neckline area and select it. Change it to the wrong side of the fabric, so choose it and select a gray color. Gray. There we go. Okay, so you can see that when you have a pretty stark, bold pattern, that you need to make sure that you can see whatever wrong sides of the fabric there are. So it needs to stand out with a darker color. Now flip to page 2. We're going to create a seamless pattern now. So navigate over to Artboard 2. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful for you to see is for this exercise and the next one, we're going to incorporate some of your original apparel flats to work with. So this particular one is from a student in class, and our next exercise is going to be from students as well. So then you can kind of see how further work will apply to other tools and steps. We are going to do the same thing again with this pattern. Choose the selection tool and draw a rectangle around it. Next, go up to Object, then Pattern, and then Make. You're going to see your pattern appear and your pattern options window. We're going to name this pattern Circles and Lines. We're going to change this tile type to Brick by Row. Because it's linear, I want to offset it to create some visual interest. And so that's what Brick by Row will do for me. And then we're going to change the brick offset to 3/4. When I do that, you'll see that it changes to this. And then we're going to choose overlap right in front. So that's going to be the one with the right diamond overlapping the left diamond. Before we close the options window, we're going to do something different to create a seamless pattern. There's a pattern tile button up in the top left corner here of your options window. So I want you to click on this icon, and the screen is going to dim, and now you have, if it's not already dim, you're going to have a bounding box that appears around your original shape. You can use the anchor points on this bounding box to draw the shape in or out. And so I'm going to take this upper left corner and I'm going to drag it in. When I do this, notice how the shapes become more locked together. So if you want to create a tighter pattern, you can use this technique, this pattern tile tool, to stretch it out or bring it in. So this is too tight, but it gives you a sense of what you're doing there. If I keep stretching, it's going to really spread out. So that's a handy thing to know if you really like to work with patterns. I want you to choose a new pattern tile arrangement that brings it in tighter. You can choose whichever arrangement you like. So I'll go in about like this. And then you can click Done in the light gray bar at the top to exit the pattern menu or pattern mode. As soon as we click Done, it has created a pattern tile in our swatches menu. So go over to the swatches panel and hover over the little thumbnail. It has added itself behind your peacock abstract pattern. If you ever get lost on which one a pattern is because the thumbnail is small, just hover over it and you'll see the name. Now, choose the selection tool and draw a box around your corset top. And then click on your circles and lines pattern to apply it to your top. So understandably, the two patterns that we've just applied look rather large and they're not very proportional. So we are going to move through to existing fabric swatches, and then at the end of that, we're going to learn how to scale patterns down so that they fit more proportionally. For section 3, one of the things that's important to know as someone who is in retail or merchandising is that as a merchandiser or a buyer, you will often be responsible for sourcing fabric. And then you need to go out and swatch your garments so that you know what swatches you want to use. Then they have to be rendered by you or someone else. So at this point, you now have a piece of fabric and it can be used as a fill for your drawings. You start by scanning an image of the actual fabric into the computer. And that sounds weird, but scanners actually pick up fabric remarkably well. Go ahead and navigate to Artboard 3. And for the purposes of this exercise, I have provided 2 fabric swatches for you of my own clothes. So I am a huge pattern fan, so I chose a couple to play around with. As I said, if you want an extra challenge, you can try drawing a flat yourself for this exercise and photographing fabric that you are wearing today to add it in. Your phone can take pretty good pictures of fabric. It's better to scan them because they lay most flat, but in a pinch, your phone will do. So flipping over to page 3, with the scanned image of the floral pattern on the top, I want you to select the rectangle tool. And then this is really key. You need to create a bounding box that captures one complete repeat of the fabric as you want to see it repeated. If there are shapes that are repeating and it won't matter, such as this swatch down below, I can choose any 4 of these squares and it's not going to matter. But if it's more complicated, like this floral pattern, I need to choose it so that it will mirror itself pretty identically. The trick to this is that you want to cut geometric shapes in half. So I'm going to choose my selection tool, or my rectangle tool, excuse me. And I'm going to draw a box. I'm going to start up in this pink circle up at the top. And then I'm going to cut the next one over in half. And then I'm going to draw down. Now, this is not exact because this fabric was rather gathered in nature, and so it was fairly difficult to get a flat swatch. But this is the reality of many fabrics you might work with for this, and so it's good to get a sense of how this goes. So I'm going to leave my box. Oh, and I need to change my fill. Because I've just put a pattern on a pattern. So you can change it to no fill. So notice how my shapes are cut in half. You don't have to mimic the exact shape that I'm doing. If you want to choose a different part of the fabric to emphasize, it could even be smaller, you can do that, but choose something so that the repeat will be what you want it to be. Then also make sure that your bounding box has no stroke as well. So no stroke, no fill. Now you're going to right-click on the white area of the artboard with your rectangle still selected, and you're going to choose Arrange, Send to Back. When I click back on my, if I use my selection tool just to make sure that it took, if I choose my fabric swatch, notice how I can't see my rectangle anymore? That's what we want to happen. Then make sure that you have your swatches panel open because you want it handy for the next couple steps. With your selection tool, draw a marquee box around the swatch and the bounding box. So make sure that both appear selected like this. Then you're going to click, hold, and drag to drop them into the swatches panel. So I'm going to click, hold, drag, and then drop it in. And instantaneously, you should see a copy of it appear in your rows. In this case, it has formed a new 4th row. Go back to your rectangle tool now and draw a rectangle below this squared light blue swatch. So in this lower right corner. It can be any size. And then go to the thumbnail and click on it of your new swatch to apply it. You can see that because the fabric isn't completely lining up, that the edges are slightly skewed in the repeat, and that's okay. Sometimes this will just be your mechanism for getting your point across in your illustrations. It doesn't always have to be exact, but you want to try and get it as exact as possible, and maybe you even want it offset like this. So it just kind of depends on what you get and what you want. Okay, so now that we've applied our new swatch, we are going to navigate to the dress. So we've got our dress here on the left side of the artboard. We want to change the stripes at the bottom of the dress to have different fills because we're going to create a sort of patchwork dress. So using your selection tool, I want you to select the top stripe here. And then apply this swatch from your swatches panel that you just created. As soon as you've done that, select the bottom stripe and then choose a solid blue color to fill in this stripe. Now go up to the top of the dress and change the fill of the triangle on the bodice to the same blue solid color that you used for the bottom stripe. At this point, we've come to the place where we want to address our scale and proportion. So let's adjust this. Using the selection tool, select the top stripe on the dress that has the pattern applied. And then right-click in the white area of the artboard and choose Transform Scale. You're going to have a Scale Options window appear. And you have the option to transform your object and your pattern, or just your pattern. You want to only scale the pattern, and so make sure that the Transform Objects box is unchecked. This will distort your illustration if you have the objects checked, and so we don't want to do that. In the upper part of this window, make sure that non-uniform is selected. And then make sure that the preview box is checked as well at the bottom. One of the things that you're going to want to play around with is the difference between uniform and non-uniform pattern application. And for the purposes of today, we're going to work with non-uniform because this is often the most realistic option when you're scaling fabric. But also make sure that you become familiar with uniform because it might apply to what you want to do. In the horizontal and vertical percentage boxes underneath non-uniform, you want to just experiment a bit with what the percentages do. So let's start by entering 20% and then 20%. If it looks a bit stretched out or skewed, one of the things you might have to do as soon as you enter the value is click into the next window, and then after you enter the vertical, put your cursor back in the horizontal box. And then it makes the change automatically with the preview. You can also, depending on your computer, achieve the same thing by hitting enter. So this is still pretty small. Go ahead and use your zoom tool. Click OK for now. And just to get a sense of what it looks like when you're zoomed in a bit more and what the scale looks like, this tells you exactly how much you've scaled the pattern down. And oftentimes what is a good idea is to start at 50% and then work down from there if you need to. But remember, if you want to choose a different scale, you need to reselect. So we need to reselect and then right-click and go back to our transform scale. So now let's choose 50%. And I'm pretty happy with this scale. And so I'm going to choose OK. So again, if you want to look at what you've just done, use the zoom tool to draw a bounding box, and then you can zoom in to see what the repeat looks like. Okay, so now we're going to apply a pattern swatch to the body of the dress. So I'm going to zoom back out. And we're going to go back to working with this swatch with the little squares repeating on it. So repeat the steps that we just did to create a pattern swatch with the floral pattern to this swatch below it. In order to do that, we need to choose our rectangle tool. And notice how at the top here, the fabric starts to curve a little bit because of the scan. So I'm going to go down towards the bottom to choose a repeat so that it's more straight. Because I see geometric shapes, I want to cut them in half to make sure that my repeat will be as I want it. So about like, I'm going to draw a 4x4 square. About like this. We've applied a pattern to a pattern again, so we need to change our fill and our stroke to none. And then, with the rectangle selected still, right-click on the white area of the artboard and choose Arrange, Send to Back. When I go back and choose my selection tool and right-click or just click in the white area of the artboard, now I only see the original swatch and not my rectangle. And again, that's how we want it. I'm going to draw a selection marquee around both the whole swatch and the bounding box rectangle underneath. So you should see both highlighted as soon as you've drawn your marquee. Then I'm going to click, hold, and drag and put my new swatch in my swatches panel. If you want to test out what your new swatch looks like, it's not required, but you can draw a rectangle. And then with it still selected, you can go to the swatches thumbnail and apply it. So it will look like this. I think it's generally a good idea to test your patterns with this rectangle method before you apply them, just to make sure you're happy with them. And that way it'll save you a couple steps down the line. So next, we are going to apply this to the body of the dress. So choose the selection tool and then choose the dress. And now apply your swatch to the dress. Now, in this case, if you want to go back and make changes to the swatch, so for example, this one isn't named yet. So if I double click on it, notice that it's giving me options to change it, and it's put me back in pattern mode. It's showing me the full swatch I originally had with a clipping mask of what the swatch is made of. So just click OK to get out of this. And then you can change the name of it. So I'm going to change this to, let's say, blue squares, just so that I keep it straight. And then I'll click Done at the top. So even if you don't bring up the pattern options menu right away, you can always go back, double click on the swatch to bring it up and make changes to the swatch. So keep that in mind. Did everybody get their pattern applied to their dress? Do we need a couple minutes with that before we move on? Okay. Let's pause for just a minute. Are there any other steps that you need to see again? Is that darn bell? That is so funny to me. How are we doing? Are we ready to move on? Generally? Okay. So the next thing we want to do is, for step 14, the fabric for the body of this dress, for the specific line that we're working with, is going to be sewn on the bias. How do we achieve this in Illustrator so that it is communicated through our illustration. We are going to indicate this to the manufacturer by rotating the pattern on the illustration. So to begin, make sure that you have the dress selected, so the body of the dress. And if you're drawing shapes on a flat and you want to make the background different like this, make sure that all of your paths for the shapes on the body of the garment are closed. So this triangle and these two bottom stripes are closed paths, and that's why I can apply a different pattern to the body of the dress. Then right-click on the white area on the artboard and choose Transform, Rotate. You're going to have a rotate window appear. And again, you have the option to rotate the object and the pattern, or just the pattern. If you rotate the entire panel, for example, if I rotate this all together with both boxes checked, look what it does. So we don't want to do that. We want it to go back the way it was. So I'm going to undo this and go back to my Transform Rotate and make sure that your transform object is not selected. Then you're going to enter a value of 40 degrees. This again is a good value to start with. So if you're interested in showing bias cut fabric in your illustrations, 40 degrees is a good value to start with, and then you can adjust from there. So I am going to choose this, and then notice how my pattern changed. It now shows what the pattern would look like if the fabric is cut on the bias. Did anybody have trouble achieving that? Got it? Okay. So now, let's go ahead and apply the steps to scale this pattern down a bit. So you can choose how you'd like to scale it down. With the dress selected, we're going to right-click on the white area and choose Transform and then Scale. And notice that because I already had 50% entered for the previous one that we worked with, it still goes back to 50%. And it's automatically transitioned this to 50% as soon as the scale window comes open. You can use a different value if you would like. I'll go ahead and leave mine at 50%. And as soon as that's done, you can click OK. So now our patterns are looking a bit more realistic for the proportion and scale. They're not quite so overwhelming. The next thing we need to do is change the color of the back neckline area to indicate the inner area of the dress. So, and it looks like I eliminated my stray line on this one. So we're good to go. I'm going to, with the dress selected, I'm going to draw a bounding box to make sure that all pieces are selected. And then I'm going to right-click on the white area in the artboard. And I'm going to choose, oh, these ones are already not grouped. Okay, so we're good to go. So always double check before you need to do this if your pieces are grouped or ungrouped. They should be grouped. And so in that case, now that I've grouped them, I should be able to choose ungrouped. At that point, I can isolate my back neckline and choose that path. They are ungrouped, and so they should not be appearing grouped. There we go. I'm not quite sure what that was doing. Okay, so I have my back neckline selected, and now I need to change it to reflect the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm going to choose a fill of dark gray. And again, it's really important that you choose a gray that's dark and will stand out, because you have a pretty severe pattern applied to this dress. So either the one next to black or the one to the side, third over, would be a good option. And then you can click on the white area of the artboard and see that that is now put together. So as good practice, we need to then go back and group our pieces together again. So draw your bounding box to select all the pieces, and then right click and group. Another thing that's important with patterns is if you have style lines, such as these princess cut style lines that are vertical down the center of the dress, then they need to stand out a bit more so that it's clear where they are when a pattern has been applied. So we need to undo our group because they need to be isolated. I'm going to select each line, and I'm going to change the stroke weight to 1.5. If I go too high, even if I go to say like 3, notice that it looks too cartoonish. It's too big. So 1.5 is generally a good stroke weight to go up to, just to emphasize the line a bit more. So change both of those lines. And then you can go back and redo your group. So now you have a complete dress with applied pattern. I want you to go back to artboards 1 and 2 and change the scale of the patterns on your peacock abstract dress and your circles and lines corset top. So I'm going to navigate back to my peacock abstract dress and zoom in so I can see what I'm doing a bit better. I'm going to select the dress. And then right click in the white area of the artboard and go to Transform Scale. Whoops. Oh, and there is my lesson in object versus pattern. So when I have this selected, notice that when I go to Transform Scale, it has transformed the scale of my object along with my pattern. So that's why it's important to undo the transform objects box. Then it restores my dress back. And notice how the 50% that's still in the box has been applied to the dress automatically now. Go ahead and play with different values and see what you like best. So I'm going to try 30%. And I hit return and got out of my window too soon, so I'm going to go back in. So in that case, I just generally, instead of hitting the return key, like to use my cursor and click back up in the box above it to apply it better. So just choose a scale that is smaller that you like. You can also do the same thing to this pattern by making it more seamless and locking the shapes together more if you want them to be closer together. So I'll stick with 30 and say okay. Next, I'm going to go over to Artboard 2 and work on my corset top. So I'm going to marquee select with my selection tool. And then transform after right-clicking on the white part of the artboard. Choose scale. And same thing. Make sure that transform objects is unchecked and then choose a scale that you like. So that looks a little bit small to me, so I'm going to try something a bit bigger. So I'll go with 40. And this is another good exercise. Notice how my style lines are getting lost in my pattern. So I need to change the stroke weight for them. You don't have to do this for the purposes of this exercise, but remember that this is important to do. You're going to complete part 4. And this is a creative exercise for you to design your own pattern with the geometric shapes and brushes and so forth, and then put it into your swatch library, and then you can submit.